course. When I spoke to him a little earlier this morning, I asked him, after seeing pictures of crowded beaches and with pubs due to open on Saturday, whether he is worried about a new spike in infections.
Yeah, I'm worried. I mean, in truth, the restrictions started to be lifted towards the end of May, the beginning of June, around that bank holiday. And I think I would guess that we will start to see a few increased in cases towards the end of June or the first week of July, and the continued lifting of restrictions, and also people deciding to take into their own hands and go about life as normal. So we're on a knife edge. It's very precarious, the situation in particularly England at the moment, and I would anticipate we would see an increase in new cases over the coming weeks. Yes.
I suppose we could, on the other hand, say that the number of new cases has not risen. It's flattening off at the moment, but it hasn't gone up again. And I know that you and Sage were advising the government a little earlier on, at the end of May, not to do this so quickly. Perhaps they were right.
I think at the end of May was too early. The number of new infections per day then was very high. There were thousands of new cases a day across the country. That number has come down, although in the last couple of weeks, the fall in those numbers per day has flattened off, as you rightly say. And in fact, the last Office of National Survey Statistics just gives a suggestion that it may have just risen again. But when you've got the numbers as low as they are now, I think it is reasonable to open up the economy. We have to get the economy opened again. People have to get back to, whilst not a normal way of life, they do have to get back to lifting the restrictions that everybody's been under, particularly, I think, around young people and schools.
So for individuals watching, wondering whether to go to the pub on Saturday, to go to a restaurant on Saturday, to jump in an aircraft and fly to the Mediterranean, what's your advice, one-to-one, as it were?
I would be really cautious, particularly around any events indoors. It's clear that being outdoors is less risky than being indoors. There is no zero risk in any of this. We're not at the stage where the virus has disappeared. The restrictions have not changed the fundamentals of the virus. It remains the same virus, or very similar to what emerged in China many months ago. It's still as infectious. It transmits from me to you just as easily as it ever did. And so we have to be really cautious. Try and stay outside, try and stay in very small numbers of people, and don't get caught in indoor settings with large numbers of people from many, many different households.
I've just come back from Scotland, and it's really interesting. The atmosphere there is different and I think more cautious. And they've had, I think, just 15 infections over the last couple of days, and Friday, Saturday, no deaths at all. Do you think we're seeing a divergence between Scotland on the one hand and England on the other?
Yeah, there's a divergence. Scotland has done very well, and they deserve great credit. And the numbers in Scotland are very much lower. They have taken a more cautious approach. You're absolutely right. They've tried to drive down the numbers harder even than England. But England is also very heterogeneous. It's different in London compared to the southwest. It's different in the northwest and the northeast. So there are regional differences. The question is now, and do we use the next 3 months? The next 3 months are absolutely critical. The numbers are lower, but the virus hasn't changed. And come the winter, come the reopening of schools, which is absolutely critical, we can anticipate to see rebounds and second waves. The question is, do you start from a very low base of, like in Scotland, a few dozen cases, or maybe a few hundred cases in England, and then you're in a good position, if there are local outbreaks, that you can respond locally and you can prevent the national catastrophe that happened in March and April. That's the key. Using June, July and August really cleverly, making sure we have everything in place and learning the lessons from February and March.
So the question is how we learn those lessons. So you mentioned track and trace at the moment. Is the track and trace system really good enough at the moment? Because the number of false results and so forth seems to be going up at the moment, not down.
Yeah, I think Baroness Harding would be the first to admit that the test, trace and isolate system is not yet fully functional. It's better that this is being put in place now. I think at the beginning of July, it'll be much better than the beginning of June. It's got to be fully functional by the beginning of September. It has to be there, that people trust it, that people are willing to use it, and people are willing to respect the results that come from it. Sure. It's not fully functional yet. It must be by September.
So, very straightforward question in a sense. You do expect a second spike. When do we start to see that happening, do you think?
Well, we're seeing second spikes now in continental Europe, in Germany, and I think we will see rebounds. It'll be in certain situations. We've had outbreaks in meat packing factories across the continent and indeed in the UK. I think a true second wave will come in the winter months, in October, November. And one of the really difficult things for all of us in September, October is going to be when we all get normal coughs and colds and children are back going to school and they get respiratory infections that are normal at that time of year. Have we got the capacity to distinguish normal respiratory infections, influenza and others, from COVID-19? Can we interrupt the chains of transmission immediately within 48 hours of new cases starting? And there will be some disruption of that as people with coughs and colds come into work, come into school places, and people need to think through the consequences of that. So we can use June, July and August. If we use them sensibly, we can prevent the national catastrophe that happened in March and April. If we don't have those core national infrastructures in place to do what is needed, then we will see a very nasty rebound in the winter.
And you've used the phrase just now, a nasty rebound in the winter months. What does that actually mean? Does that mean many, many more people losing their lives over the winter from COVID?
It could do. I mean, there's no doubt that nurses, doctors, people in hospitals have become better at treating patients with COVID. We've learned a huge amount about the disease and we're better at treating it today. And mortality rates have come down over the 6 months. But it is still a very, very nasty infection. You've got to move faster than the epidemic. You've got to move ahead of the pandemic. Once you get behind it and you have exponential growth, you lose track of it. And that's what happened across Europe, but particularly in the UK, in March and April of this year. We got behind it. We were too slow. And as a result, the epidemic took off and we weren't able to control it. We must avoid that. And if we do the right things in June, July and August, we can.
So let me ask you about what using those months sensibly means, because I think we've still got the extra hospital capacity, maybe mothballed at the moment, so that's there. And the government said that they're going to stop a second wave that, quotes, overwhelms the NHS, which implies to a lot of people that there will be a second wave, but it won't be quite that bad. What else does the government have to do in that intervening period?
You've got to make sure that there's trust. The society, the communities trust the government advice because public health is based on trust. Got to make sure the testing is in place and easily accessible to everybody. That people who have a test are not disincentivized. They're not hurt financially or in other ways by having a test and therefore want to have a test. It's in their interest. We have to protect the vulnerable. Care home debacle can never happen again. We know that the elderly are more at risk. We know that people from BAME communities are more at risk. We need to make sure we protect those individuals. You
mentioned earlier on the other great key to all of this, which is a vaccine. And I know that you've got an oversight in what's going on around the world. We've talked about the Oxford team, we've talked to the Imperial team here, but I think it's something like 130 different vaccine teams working around the world. And I read this week that China seems to be a little bit ahead. Is that your understanding? And if the Chinese get a vaccine, will we get it too?
Yeah, there's about 150 vaccines in development, you're right. There's probably about 20 which are at advanced stages. As you mentioned, the Oxford AstraZeneca one and the one from Imperial. Yes, China has got at least 4 or 5 vaccines that I know of, and China has a long and very proud tradition in vaccine development. They produce a number of very, very, very good vaccines, and they are very advanced. China will need to work with the rest of the world because there are so few cases in China now that in order to find out if the vaccine works and is safe, those are the 2 really important things that we have to do. We cannot cut corners on that. Then China will have to work with the rest of the world because there are just not enough cases in China. China has done such a remarkable job to reduce the number of patients with COVID in the country itself. So China is working. It's working with CEPI, it's working with WHO, it's working with many countries around the world to look how you can test those Chinese vaccines, not in China, but in the rest of the world. And what is important is that we don't retreat, and there is a danger of this in today's political world. We don't retreat into a nationalistic agenda. There is no enlightened self-interest in it being a Chinese vaccine or a British vaccine or an American vaccine or a German or Indian or a Cuban. We don't know where the vaccine will come from. And certainly I've been very concerned of something akin to vaccine nationalism, where I've got my vaccine, but you haven't got one. And if we do that, the world will polarize, the world will become ever more nationalistic, and we won't sort out the pandemic. So it's neither a good scientific, it's not smart scientifically, and it's not good in terms of geopolitics.
England has not had a great record over this period in terms of the proportional number of deaths and so on, and regularly the politicians get criticised for that. But I wonder if the scientists can be blamed in some sense too, that right at the beginning of all of this, perhaps the scientific advice to ministers underestimated both the number of infections and the scale and speed of the epidemic spreading.
Yeah, there's no individual to blame here. Everybody has made mistakes. I mean, I've come from a scientific side, so there's no doubt that none of us had seen an epidemic that had spread as fast as this and as geographically dispersed as this. And I think increasingly we're learning actually this was probably spreading in December, if not before that.
So the advice that ministers were getting wasn't actually accurate at the beginning?
Well, you can't be accurate at the beginning, and that's the truth. What you have to do as a scientist at the beginning is be open to all possibilities. I went through SARS when living in Vietnam and then through bird flu, and the lesson I learned is don't ever underestimate the power of a respiratory infection to spread around the world. It is devastating. And if you underestimate it, if you don't prepare, if you don't work faster than the pandemic itself, you will get behind it as it goes into its exponential phase. And then you take months to catch up. And that's exactly what has happened. And yes, there were undoubtedly mistakes made that will come back to be reviewed, I'm sure, in the future. But I do think now, June, July and August, come back to these next 3 months. These next 3 months will define the rebounds and second waves that we will go into in the end of 2020 and throughout 2021. We have a chance to stop these epidemics becoming pandemics. We have a chance to stop local outbreaks becoming national catastrophes. Right. If we learn the lessons that went wrong in February, in January and March, then we can stop that happening. But we have to learn the lessons.
Sir Jeremy, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.